Most biographies try to explain who Max Verstappen is by tracing childhood moments, personality traits, and defining quotes, searching for the origins of his talent, aggression, and confidence. But that approach misses the most important pattern. What separates Max Verstappen isn't who he is. It's how he behaves when pressure appears. This isn't the story of his life. It's the story of repeated exposure to pressure, and how that exposure reshaped the speed, direction, and efficiency of his responses. By the end, it becomes clear that Max Verstappen didn't develop a unique personality. He developed a different relationship with pressure. Early exposure to performance consequences. Max Verstappen entered competitive racing unusually early in his life. From the very beginning, his performance was measured immediately and clearly. Results mattered from day one. Errors had visible, tangible consequences that couldn't be ignored or rationalized away. Feedback wasn't abstract or delayed. It was instant and unambiguous. There was no prolonged buffer period where mistakes could hide comfortably inside development phases or be cushioned by excuses. That particular environment fundamentally changes how pressure registers in a young competitor's mind. When consequences arrive early and consistently throughout your formative years, pressure stops feeling episodic or exceptional. It becomes routine instead, not dramatic, not optional, but simply part of the daily reality. This routine exposure to high-stakes situations became the foundation of everything that followed in his career. How early normalization changes response speed. Pressure doesn't just affect emotions, it affects timing. When pressure is constant early, the nervous system stops flagging it as a threat. It becomes data instead of danger. The behavioral effects are measurable. Faster stabilization after mistakes, reduced emotional carryover between moments, shorter reset loops. Instead of reacting to pressure, behavior adjusts within it. This isn't toughness or resilience in the traditional sense. It's familiarity. The system learns to process high-stakes situations as baseline conditions rather than anomalies. Pressure stops demanding attention and cognitive resources. What once triggered fight or flight becomes simply the environment in which decisions are made. The advantage isn't that pressure feels smaller, it's that it no longer interrupts the process. Junior categories. Pressure without protection. Verstappen's progression through junior categories was accelerated. There were no long developmental shelters, no extended periods to mature quietly. He was compared immediately against older, more experienced competitors. That matters because learning happened inside chaos, not after it. Decision-making wasn't refined in controlled environments. It was sharpened in real-time competition, where mistakes carried consequences and recovery had to be immediate. Pressure wasn't something you prepared for. It was something you operated inside. The absence of gradual steps meant adaptation became instinctive. Every race demanded immediate competence. There was no luxury of time, no room for hesitation. Only execution mattered. F1. Entry. Pressure before preparation. That pattern intensified dramatically with his Formula One entry. Verstappen arrived on the grid before most drivers would normally complete their junior development program. Public scrutiny followed instantly, and every move was analyzed. His errors were highly visible, and opinions about his approach were consistently loud from media and competitors alike. What stands out when reviewing this period isn't simply the presence of mistakes, it's the response pattern that emerged. Errors were acknowledged quickly without defensiveness. His aggressive driving style appeared early, then systematically refined through experience. Most crucially, there was no retreat from pressure moments or challenging situations. Instead of avoiding high-pressure racing scenarios, he deliberately remained inside them until his behavior and racecraft adjusted naturally. That's exposure doing its work most effectively. How behavior evolved. This distinction matters fundamentally. Personality didn't change. Behavior did. Over time, visible reactions gave way to internal regulation. External frustration was replaced by silent correction. Confrontation faded, and execution took over. That transition isn't about maturity in the abstract sense. It's about efficiency in practice. When pressure becomes familiar, expressing it externally becomes unnecessary and even counterproductive. Regulation becomes internal because it's faster, cleaner, and more effective. The same pressure exists beneath the surface, applying the same force it always did. What changes is the response pathway, the mechanism through which that pressure is processed and channeled. This shift represents not emotional growth, but operational optimization, a refinement of how energy is spent and where effort is directed. The role of system stability. Another critical factor is continuity. Verstappen operated inside a long-term environment with consistent expectations, feedback loops, and internal references. That stability reduced cognitive load. When fewer variables change, correction cycles shorten. When expectations are predictable, execution sharpens. Pressure still arrives, but it arrives into a system that already knows how to process it. Stability doesn't remove pressure. It makes pressure easier to digest. Dominance doesn't remove pressure. Dominance often gets misunderstood. It removes uncertainty, not pressure. During dominant phases, Verstappen's behavior didn't soften. Preparation didn't drop. Emotional spikes didn't appear after wins. There was no reliance on motivation or external reinforcement. Pressure didn't disappear. It shifted from survival to standards. When survival pressure fades, execution pressure increases. The demand becomes internal rather than situational. That's why dominant seasons didn't change his behavior, they refined it. When the advantage faded, when performance advantages narrowed, the response was revealing. There was no visible panic, no escalation, no emotional inflation. Instead, behavior simplified. Focus narrowed to controllables. Decision-making compressed. Inputs became cleaner. That response only exists when pressure has stopped being novel. Drivers who treat pressure as a signal of threat escalate. Drivers who treat it as information simplify. This was simplification, not retreat. What this biography is actually about. This isn't a story about talent. It's not about aggression, upbringing, nationality, or emotion. It's about exposure and adaptation, about how repeated pressure changes processing speed, how early normalization removes latency, how behavior becomes efficient, not because pressure disappears, but because it stops feeling special. This biography doesn't explain who Max Verstappen is. It explains why his reactions look different. The real Verstappen throughline. Here's the throughline. Max Verstappen didn't become calm by removing pressure from his career. He became calm because pressure stopped being exceptional. Once pressure becomes routine, it stops demanding reaction. It stops hijacking decision-making. It stops lingering. What remains is execution. That's the real story. Most biographies look for emotion to explain Max Verstappen. They're looking in the wrong place. If you want to understand him, don't study how he feels. Study how fast he adapts when the pressure arrives. If you're Orange Army, you've watched this evolution happen season by season, often without language attached to it. Share this with another Max fan who understands that pressure doesn't define drivers by how hard it hits, but by how quickly they move on from it.